So maybe we can start with the first question. It's maybe quite a general question, but what are, in the usage of AGP, what are AGP benefits? What are the issues of their withdrawals? I may ask maybe to Theo first to answer to that question. I hope that the connection with Leuven is still working. Theo, can you answer to that question?
I think it's pretty clear what their benefits were. That they just promoted growth and health. And also what they did was to keep the pathogens down. So what we see is, what is one of the issues of the withdrawal is that we see indeed certain pathogens which benefit from inflammation in the intestine, like for instance Clostridia. They are on the rise, and that is not a coincidence. So it's rather important that we still use certain compounds which are able to dampen inflammation, to also contain those pathogens and still benefit growth and health.
So Philippe, on the same question, the usage of AGP and their benefits and the loss we have with their withdrawal. What is your feeling on that?
Okay, well, the benefits were quite clear. I think they improved animal performance, so which means they improved body weight gain and also improved feed conversion, decreased feed conversion. So it clearly had an economical advantage. So that's, of course, by the actual reason why they worked is not really too clear, I think, but probably they suppressed part of the gram-positive flora, so that at least you had less subclinical infections also, which contributes to the economical advantage. Specifically, I'm thinking about Clostridia again, but also you had less interference with nutrient digestion in the small intestinal tract, so that more nutrients were available for the host. In addition, you have, of course, anti-inflammatory effects, maybe also either directly by the AGPs or maybe indirectly by suppressing the microbiota. This is not yet clear. So the effects of withdrawing would be, in principle, again, animal performance becoming a little bit worse, but of course you have quite some additives to restore that. So.
It's quite interesting, in fact, to look at both aspects, the microbiota and the inflammation part. So maybe another question from the web. What are the criteria to take into account to set up an efficient AGP-free strategy? I think it's quite relevant to the previous question, so I will ask Theo, and I hope the Belgian connection is still working, on that first question.
That has, in my opinion, to do with the availability of really efficient alternatives. And that has been, I think, largely the problem with the old theory about the working mechanism of AGP that was based on the antimicrobial strategy. And it wouldn't surprise you that I'd rather say it should be based on the anti-inflammatory theory. So use components which have a proven effect on inflammation. And I think that's the way to go forward, because don't use proven concepts and alternatives, then farmers will still be tempted to go for the old compounds, so to speak.
So, Philippe, the potential, your potential answer on the potential criteria we should take into account to set up alternatives.
Yeah. Well, an alternative program, I think there are many, there are different things you have to consider there. First of all, I guess the overall management of the farm is important, meaning that the biosecurity plan is crucial, I guess. I mean, you have to make sure that the animal spends energy in not in combating potential infections. So that's why biosecurity is so important. You have to exclude potential pathogens, keep them out of the flock, of the farm, and also make sure that there's no spread within the farm or between different flocks. So biosecurity is one thing. Secondly, of course, there are quite a lot of possibilities to, let's say, stabilize the gut microbiota, or even stabilize the gut barrier at least, with a lot of different feed additives that are available on the market, of which some are quite helpful, I guess, in really making sure that the bacteria that are present in the gut are really these ones that have anti-inflammatory effects and stabilize the gut barrier. So I think there are quite some possibilities to, have an AGP-free flock.
Okay, thank you. Maybe another question from the web, which is relevant to your both presentation. I would say what biomarkers could we think about to appreciate gut health in broilers, and maybe one even more for Theo. How can we detect gut inflammation in gut broilers?
Yes, as I just said in my presentation. There is one in broilers, and that's a fecal, or it's not the exact term in broilers, of course, a biomarker in the excreta, and that's neopterin. That is indeed quite a rapid method, meaning you will have the results in 1 day. Very simple. You could just take droppings from a pen. For instance, if you want to compare two treatments from one department, you pick up the droppings in the other one and then compare them. So you will get your values in a day, which will enable you to, for instance, make adjustments in the composition of feed, or just adding anti-inflammatory compounds, etc. So I'm very optimistic.
Philippe, I'm sure that you have maybe a different interpretation from Theo on what potential biomarkers. And I would say I insist on the fact, talking about also practical biomarkers that we can use in the field.
Well, I don't know whether I have a different view on biomarkers than Theo, but I think you have you have quite a lot of potential possibilities for biomarkers for gut health. And basically, when you look at the gut, I mean, the gut barrier is important, so that means that epithelial integrity is important. The epithelial cells need to be very closely connected to each other to avoid that you have toxins or feed compounds leaking into the mucosa and causing inflammation. That's one thing. And secondly, also you have to have a closed epithelial barrier to avoid that all kind of proteins are leaking into the gut, and this would also be an energy loss. So this gut barrier is maybe point one. You can detect some of the proteins that make connections between the epithelial cells, and if you have a lot of gut damage, for example, you can potentially detect these proteins, the tight junction markers, as it is called, in the fecal material. That's one thing. Secondly, of course, you have these inflammation markers. Meaning that in cases of severe inflammation in the gut, you have a lot of immune cells that secrete a lot of different compounds, and some of them are some of these immune cells, they are really transmigrating, and they end up in the gut lumen, and also will end up in the fecal material. And some of these proteins that are inside these immune cells, such as neutrophils, heterophils in chickens, they are also secreted there, and it can be found in the fecal material. That's the second thing. Thirdly, of course, you have potentially also some microbial markers, because if you have an unfavorable microbiota composition in the gut, you would of course also be able to detect that in the fecal material. This can be done by DNA techniques, very simple DNA techniques, just quantifying certain populations or ratios of populations. So in fact, the most crucial thing, I guess, is really to have an easy field test at the end, what would mean that you need some kind of an test on fecal material, ELISA test or something else that is easily detecting these different markers. That's, I think, crucial. We can't have some test that we take a fecal sample, we submit it to a laboratory, and then have to wait for 2 weeks before we have a reply. It should be something that is very fast, reliable, standardized, and that's what we need to develop, I think. It's not really the case yet, also because many of the tests being developed, for example, for humans, they are not valid in chickens because, chicken
they don't have the same
proteins,
function.
they don't have the same protein homologs, for example, so it's a completely different animal. You can apply that to pigs maybe, but not to chickens. So we are still struggling a bit with that, but in the future it will be developed. I'm quite confident.
How far do you think it's possible to have this type of biomarkers ready to use in poultry production and on a quite rapid economic basis? This type of biomarkers. How far from now you think it could be available?
I think, some people are working on it. We are also working on it in our university. I think it would be possible to have these kind of things within the next few years, and really to put a number on it. Maybe something like, 2 to 3 years if we are lucky. And if we are unlucky, something like 5 or 6 years. It depends a bit how lucky we are with detecting potential biomarkers and identifying the good ones. That's always a little bit a risk, I think, because it doesn't only have to work in the laboratory. It
has
should
to
work in the
practice.
field, of course. That's the most difficult thing.
Thank you, Philippe. Maybe another question from the web? Maybe a tricky question. Should we look for more mucin production or less for better gut health? And I'm sure maybe looking at inflammation, we can ask Theo to answer first to that question. Theo?
I'm afraid that I don't have an answer to that. I don't see the direct connection between mucin and gut health. So I'm not the person to answer.
Yeah, good. Maybe Philippe, you can react on that, on the mucin aspects. Should we have more or less mucin?
It's a very difficult question. I don't think I know the exact answer. Mucin production is obviously also sometimes increased mucin production is also sometimes a consequence of a certain insult, pathogenic insult. For example, coccidia, they increase mucin production if you have an Emeria infection, coccidiosis, for example, and that is then maybe linked to the fact that if you look at microbiota, some of them can use mucins, can live in the mucus. One of the examples of a pathogenic bacterium that can do that is Clostridium perfringens. It likes to eat mucins, and for example, that's probably the reason why if you have coccidiosis, an increased mucin production, that you have some kind of a predisposing
environment
effect for necrotic enteritis, predisposing environment for the induction of necrotic enteritis by Clostridium. So that's one thing. Of course, you also have other bacterial species that can consume mucus, and also some of these are quite interesting because some of these produce high quantities of butyric acid. You have some examples, Akkermansia is one of them, but these ones are very beneficial because we as a host, or the chicken as a host, provide them with certain substrate, mucins, which enables these bacteria to live very closely in contact with the epithelial cells, and they provide us with butyrate, which is a very anti-inflammatory molecule, which strengthens the epithelial barrier, etc., so which has very positive effects. So it depends a bit on the situation. I think it depends which microbiota is present in the gut, but in fact, if you think about it, it's a very, very interesting system in which we as a host give some kind of a feed to some bacteria that we need for an optimal gut health. I think it's amazingly interesting to consider that.
Yeah, more and more complex for the nutritionist always, I think. Maybe a last question from the web. What about lameness? Can gut health promoting compounds to be used to control emerging disease? I'm sure that when we talk about lameness, it's more what we heard yesterday about in the conference about the translocation of bacteria from the intestinal area to the rest of the body, in respiratory tract, in joints, and so on. And people are concerned more and more now on how gut health can improve or reduce this type of translocation of bacteria. A comment maybe directly from Philippe.
that's a good point, I think, because this is in fact an emerging problem in the broiler industry, lameness. And if you look at these conditions, then if you look at, well, for example, one of the conditions is bacterial chondronecrosis with osteomyelitis. You also have spondylitis, so different problems with bacteria that translocate from the gut to the bloodstream, and then for some reason attach or colonize specific places in the body, such as the joints. These bacteria, if you isolate them from these specific places, they are E. coli or Enterococci, and these Enterococcus species, they are typically Enterococcus secorum, which is one of the bacteria you very often find there. But these bacteria, they are just gut inhabitants. So that means that they originate from the gut, and probably this gut permeability or this epithelial barrier strength is really key also in this kind of disorder. So when you don't have an properly functioning gut, and when you don't have a good epithelial resistance, when you have high permeability, this can also translocate and end up at these specific locations, which means that, for example, with interfering in the gut with probiotics or other compounds that stabilize the gut barrier or modify the gut microbiota composition to a favorable one, that you can also control diseases outside of the gut. That's also fairly interesting that bacterial signals, in fact, that you can steer with feed or feed additives can be altered so that certain syndromes or conditions or diseases outside of the gut can be controlled. That's also a fairly interesting concept.
So it's interesting to see how gut health can influence, in fact, the global health of the animal. So we should not separate the things, I would say, and really consider the health as a global issue for the animal productions. So I think we have much more questions, but we will let maybe the answer coming on the web after. And you will receive questions that we could not answer this afternoon, Philippe and Theo, and hope you will be able to answer to our participants. And before to say bye-bye to everyone, I should not stop here in December before closing the seminar without wishing all of you Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, and hope to see you all in 2017.